Hello there, welcome to Nerd.World History. On this channel I explore anything and everything historical that takes my interest, and today it's a character he's somewhat mythical and somewhat not, because we don't really know much about him, and there's a little conjecture as to whether or not he really existed. And that is Vortigern. Vortigern was a post-Roman, possibly Romano-British leader of some description anyway. He may have been a member of the military or the leading aristocracy in Britannia in the late Roman period, and when the Romans withdrew in the early 5th century, he kind of took over and was regarded generally as the High King of the Britons, although that is a more modern context, as those are descriptions of him wrote down centuries later. References to him are made by monks known as Bede and Gildas, who are Anglo-Saxon Christian monks who wrote about him or referenced him centuries later, but their accounts are somewhat often skewed and not always 100% reliable. What is probably true is there probably was some kind of warlord who took over in Britain when the Romans left, and he seemed to hold the country together, but bear in mind there hadn't been any local militaries outside of the control of the Romans since he left, so he had a monumental problem on his hands when the legions pissed off. And that's what we're going to look at. Before we get started, please like, share, subscribe and comment down below, and let's get started on what we know or don't know about Vortigern, High King of the Britons. Now, as stated, Vortigern was a ruler of the British Isles, probably of what we now consider to be England and Wales, more or less, in the early 5th century, taking over where the Romans left off after they left in about 410 AD. Now, as I said, he was left without an army, or at least anything coherent. There likely were leftover auxiliary troops, Roman soldiers who didn't leave, some that stayed behind, ex-soldiers that maybe had land, retired soldiers, whatever. So he may have been able to cobble together some kind of militia. However, the Roman Empire had been under siege from barbarians for years. All of Europe was fairly chaotic around this time, being attacked mostly from incoming invaders from the east, who themselves were actually being driven from the east by even more violent cultures further east, cultures such as the Franks, who would invade France or Gaul, giving it its name, France. France actually was attacked by a lot of different people. It's famous for the Anglo-Saxons invading of Britain, but actually the Anglo-Saxons, they also went to France. The Britons also would invade the area of northern France now known as Brittany, which would always have a historical connection linguistically, culturally to the British Isles, more so than the rest of France, particularly to Cornwall and Wales, for reasons that we're not really going to go into in this. But at the time, this is pre what we know as Anglo-Saxon England, or the establishment of anything like England. Vortigern had no army. He was under attack from the Scots, who actually at the time came from Ireland. I know this gets a little confusing with Franks actually being German, not French, and the Germans themselves being attacked by the Huns, hence their future names, etc. We had the Picts attacking from the north, and the Picts were basically Celts, or the Caledonians, who had been unified over years of conflict with the Romans. The Picts were ostensibly, though, Celts. You also had the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes coming from Germany and Denmark, attacking from the east. So you had east, you had west, and you had north. But the Saxons in particular, we're a pseudo-Celtic culture, but they were not by any means a unified people, and many of them were mercenaries. So Vortigern hit on a simple idea: use Saxons to fight Saxons. So he hired two Saxon warlords, Hengist and Hengist, and invited them to Britain and their armies to fight off other Saxons from what is now historically known as the Saxon shore forts on the eastern coast. They did this very successfully, fighting off their kinsmen and stopping raids. But then there's the famous problem: Vortigern had no money, and he couldn't afford to pay them. So what he did instead was he gave them land. Now, history I was taught in school on this subject says that the Saxons simply took land because they could, and he couldn't stop them. They were his own army, and they turned on him. But that may or may not be true. The thing is, we don't know, not for certain. He certainly made a blunder in not having the ability to pay them. But it may have been an agreement to pay them in Landen to begin with. Bear in mind, the collapse of Western economy was taking place at this time with the fall of the Roman Empire. Money might not have had much value. Maybe his coffers were overflowing with coin that had no value to the Saxons. After all, food, water, and somewhere to live is a bit more important than gold. Before you start worrying about whether you got gold, you start worrying about whether you got food. He gave them the territory we now know as Kent, which became a small minor kingdom of Anglo-Saxon England in later years. Now, subsequent generations would actually fight against them, but during Vortigern's reign there was no actual known conflict recorded directly between Vortigern and any particular British army and those Saxons. It was only later generations, particularly under his son, where they would attack them and die, and then you start to see the first spread of Anglo-Saxon culture across the rest of England. And the so-called Briton culture, the British, pushed back into Wales. Now, I'm fairly positive that this isn't an exactly accurate account of exactly what happened in history. It's definitely a skewed version of it. And I personally usually blame the Victorians, as they tended to rewrite history to a way that suited their narrative. And being Christian, they like to see Christianity reign. And it just wasn't that black and white back then. It's not as black and white as to say the Anglo-Saxons came in and invaded. All English people are certainly not descended from Anglo-Saxons. And as an Irish friend of mine will hate me saying, we have just as much Celtic blood in us as they do. Our ancestors were Celtic too. They were here before the Romans. They didn't just all up and leave when the Romans came, and the Romans didn't all up and leave, leaving no one living here for the Angles and Saxons to move in. That's not how it works. We're a mixed bag of a people like any country in the world. Vortigern was probably Romano-British, for example, which means he was likely of both Roman and local British stock. So he'll have been of Celtic, which was native British at the time, and Roman descent. Much like as a historical figure such as King Arthur may have been, if he actually existed. The difference is Vortigern, 99% pretty much did exist. It's just a lot of his legends and stories about him are obviously skewed through time. One thing we do know, he was a powerful man who ruled over Britain, and during his lifetime at least, stability remained across Britain for a time, until the chaos of the continent really started to spill over. And that's when we have the so-called Dark Ages, where technology was lost, written records were not really widely kept. And that's why you don't really get proper written accounts of Vortigern until you get Gildas and Bede many centuries later writing about him. So, I mean, really put yourself in their place. Imagine now, wherever you are in the world, imagine now your nice comfortable life is disrupted by an invading army of men and women coming to take your home and your territory from you. There's no army in the place to stop them. Your local government is corrupt as hell or just completely fallen apart. And what are you going to do to stop them? And in fact, are you going to sit around and write about it, or are you going to run the fuck away? Or are you going to start fighting and possibly die? So basically that's the Dark Ages. You've got one group of people who don't write very much down, if anything at all, invading territories where people did, but that reading and writing got pushed to the edges because there was just no time during an invasion to write down, we are currently being invaded by the Angles and the Saxons, their names are this, our names are this, I live here. It's not going to happen. You run away. Any records that may have been wrote down in that time period, very few of them have survived. So first-hand accounts of Vortigern are pretty hard to come by, but he did exist, and he made a stupid decision on the one hand, inviting the Angles and the Saxons in to defend against other Saxons. But you got to put yourself in context of the time period. Just because you were born in a place didn't mean you fought for that place. And those people were offered a pretty sweet deal. Rather than come here and fight us, how about we give you the land and all the territory you're after? In exchange, you then help us defend it and us. Sound good? We'll work together. You're not the pirates and murderers coming here, abducting our people, stealing all of our stuff. So let's work together. Pretty sweet deal. So really, he may have been a genius. We don't know. You got to sometimes put yourself in the perspective of the man of the time. And what was the best decision? Maybe he didn't have a good choice. He didn't have time to raise an army. There might not have been enough soldiers left around to train new soldiers. There wasn't the resources or the economy or the infrastructure in place to support such an army. So what's he going to do? He's got a small militia force, most likely, at his disposal, enough to maybe keep law and order, not enough to defend the borders of Britannia against all of its enemies. The Picts, who've been itching to spill over the border for centuries against Romans who they didn't like very much, the Scoti from Ireland just constantly raiding, and then the Angles and the Saxons being driven from their homelands through environmental problems, as well as the invasion of the Huns, as well as general other instabilities. They themselves were under attack also from the Franks. It's actually fair to say that things on the continental side of the Channel were far more unstable and less predictable than they were in Britain. So Britain actually becomes a more tempting place to go, even though it seems horrendous. England in particular wasn't unified until the days, in fact not even Alfred the Great, it was his grandson that actually unified all of England. You're talking 9th century, we're back in the 5th, that's 400 years of turmoil. Not much wrote down, no new roads being built, they're not building very new anything really. In fact, if anything, things get smaller, more fucked up, more destroyed, and that was considered more stable than what was going on in Europe. And from what I remember of Europe at that time, not an unfair assessment. The problem is, to get to Britain, you had to come by sea. Moving an army by sea is not easy. Moving an army by land, it was a lot more tempting, a lot easier just to walk across the border, ford a few rivers, than it was to ford the English Channel. Now, as I said, Vortigern took control of Britain probably somewhere perhaps around 425 AD. Now that's a bit of a gap as well between the 410 AD, when the Romans officially pretty much stopped coming to Britain. That's when the Roman Emperor told the British people to look to their own defences as the remaining garrison in Britain, if you can call it that. As I said, they were talking at bare minimum auxiliaries, were not sufficient to defend Britain against its enemies. Most of the British Legion had been withdrawn from Britain to fight enemies in Gaul and closer to Rome, as of course Rome itself was being attacked by the Visigoths, as Gaul was being invaded by Franks and others. There just wasn't the resources in the Western Empire anymore to defend against such massive waves of invaders. Now, previous emperors in Britain had all made plays for the imperial throne. This was another problem with the late Roman imperial period. Different usurpers kept trying to take power, such as Constantine III, who was declared emperor by the actual British army in, I believe, 407 AD. And he took more troops out of Britain. So by the time we get to 410, there's nothing left. By the time we get to 425, there's really nothing. Even the few soldiers who were left were probably too old or were dead to really be of any use, and there were very few professional soldiers left around. Maybe a few hundred, maybe 1,000, maybe 5,000, maybe none at all. It's kind of hard to say. But Vortigern never made a play for emperor, as others, such as Magnus Maximus, who's another interesting historical figure I might touch on at some point, had made a play for the imperial throne. He just sort of stayed in Britain and said, you know what, this is my territory, this is what I'm going to keep, and I'm going to keep it safe. So for at least a generation, life didn't change. There are archaeological evidence of things like bathhouses being rebuilt, but they're sort of built to a substandard. I remember one that I may have to look up at some point to remember exactly where this was, but there was a stone bathhouse in Britain that went into sort of slight disuse. It was in need of repair, and there's obvious repairs been done, but it was knocked down partially and rebuilt in timber rather than stone. In and of itself, there's nothing wrong with building out of timber, but as most bathhouses tended to be built from stone, there's a noticeable change in the skill level of construction already. And we're talking one generation in here. That was in the 5th century AD. Again, it's wrong to assume that the Romans, when they buggered off, took all their ideas with them. Roads still remained. We still had bathhouses. In fact, bathhouses have never really gone away in Britain. They're still around. In a sense, you could call a swimming pool one. Bathhouses were still around right into the medieval period, into the late medieval period. They were still relatively common. It's a myth that everyone thinks that everyone in medieval Europe was dirty, grubby, and covered in muck all the time. It's not true. People had an idea of cleanliness. Remember, Christianity, which was the dominant religion of Western Europe, does actually state you should be clean, you should wash yourself. And although regular bathing wasn't a major thing, semi-regular washing was. People may not have had indoor plumbing and baths in their own houses, but there were bathhouses pretty much in every town. Now, as I said, Roman way of life continued in Britain fairly stably for about a generation. There was enough strength and power here to maintain that way of life, particularly with the deal made with the Saxons to help defend the coast. But eventually the sheer number and weight of invaders overwhelmed any kind of defence, and chaos reigned up. In a sense, luckily, instabilities back home in between the Picts and Scotia actually meant that they weren't invading as much, because they themselves had problems. We're not talking early Vikings or anything, but we're talking they were at each other's throats as much as they were at ours. And that in a way saved what was left of Britain. And also with so many sort of proto-Viking cultures in the Angles, Saxons and Jutes coming into England, they brought at least with them armies that could actually fight off other local problems. And that's when you see the rise of warlords. Vortigern himself, of course, was one of these warlords. There's no doubt about it. He was by no means a man of peace. It's not like he instituted any kind of concept of goodwill and democracy to all men and women. That's not true. But he did manage to keep Britain stable, at least in his lifetime. For a generation, things remained stable and relatively peaceful. But there was a slow, gradual decline, and within 100 years of the loss of the Romans, Britain was practically unrecognizable. It can only be thought that maybe if just a few more troops had stayed behind, or if Vortigern had been able to raise a real army in Britain rather than have to rely on foreign mercenaries, maybe that way of life would have remained, but it's probably not likely, not with the weight of enemies they had mounting against them. So, I have it. I mean, there's more to Vortigern, information about his wife, but most other things you find about him is probably mythical. Which, I don't really want to touch on the mythology, just on what we definitely know. We don't know when he was born, we don't exactly know when he died. We just know that he was considered High King of the Britons, which itself is an interesting term, because king was not a word that has made its way to England at that time. So he wouldn't have been known as High King. Maybe High Chieftain or Ruler or some other derivative name. He may even have been referred to as Emperor. Britain has never really had emperors, but there have been, particularly during the Roman period, certain men declared emperor in Britain. Such, very famously, Constantine the Great was declared emperor in Britain, as was Constantine III, as was Magnus Maximus. But for domestic rule, not really, but he may have taken that title at the time. I like to think he did, because we don't really have any other emperors from any other time in history, so it'd be nice if we can say Emperor Vortigern of Britain, just because it sounds kind of nice. Anyway, what have I missed about Vortigern? I know I'm skipping over the major details of his life, but a lot of it is so unknown. It's like there's stories of major battles where a large Saxon army was defeated in northern England, but there's no archaeological evidence for it. It was wrote about centuries later. It may never have happened. But there we go. Vortigern, maybe emperor, maybe high king of the Britons, from about 425 AD, approximately. I hope you enjoyed that video on Vortigern. I have a Warcraft character named after him who's actually a warrior. He's a Worgen, if you're interested. Just because he's a historical figure who interests me, because I like things where there are gaps in knowledge. And I like things where you can imagine what these people maybe were like and the things that they did in their lifetimes. Because that's far more interesting than probably the things they actually did. I mean, realistically, this man managed to keep Britain stable and safe for at least one more generation, which is a hell of an accomplishment. And he should be remembered for that, rather than just being remembered as the idiot who forgot to pay his army and it turned on him. Which probably isn't true anyway. So, Vortigern, maybe Emperor, maybe High King. Please like, share, subscribe, comment down below, and thanks for watching.